So in this final topic, we're going to focus on defects. So what is a defect in timber? Well, it's defined as any irregularity in the timber that occurs in or on the timber which may lower its strength, its durability, its appearance, or its value. Defects can be classified into three main causes, being natural defects, defects due to seasoning or the seasoning process, and defects due to fungus or insect attack. So firstly, let's look at natural defects. So natural defects are those which are characteristic of the wood and are present in the growing tree, such as knots. And I think we're probably all familiar with, knots in timber. Some timbers have them quite prominently. Radiata pine is a really good example. We've all seen knots in pine in particular. So knots are caused as branches form on the tree. There's an obvious change in grain direction, which can cause problems when working with the timber. Knots can also reduce the strength of the timber owing to the short or cross grain which surrounds them. So basically, you've got a very distinct difference in the direction of the grain. And here you can see an example of what is known as a dead knot. So this cross grain also causes difficulty when planing, can often cause a lot of tear out, and can cause warping and checking in the timber. Generally, knots are an appearance defect, but sometimes it can be a structural defect. And I suppose the difference there is, knots can introduce something that doesn't look good, but occasionally, and depending on where it is, a knot can actually weaken the timber. So live knots have its growth ring completely intergrown with those of the surrounding wood. So that's where a branch, the tree is sort of growing bigger and bigger, and it's growing over a living branch. Dead knots are where the fibres are not intergrown with the surrounding wood, and the knot cannot be relied on to remain in position in the piece. Often they'll fall out and you'll have a knot hole. Now this example here is a dead knot. And that's probably where the branch either had bark already on the branch as the tree grew over it, or it might have been damaged. So often you'll find, from a fire or something like that, will cause that sort of distinction or barrier between the knot and the surrounding timber. Burls or burrs are tree growths in which the grain has grown in a deformed manner, commonly found in the form of a rounded out growth on a tree trunk or branch that is filled with small knots from dormant buds. And you can see, the example here. You can see what it looks like on a growing tree, and then we're about to talk about how they're actually quite valuable. They're believed to be caused by an injury to the tree. Burls are highly prized for veneers or turned bowls. So the thing with a burl is it depends on how it's being used. So for example, if that particular tree there was being harvested for, floorboards or structural timbers, that would be regarded as a defect. However, the reality is that particular piece of timber there is quite valuable, and people do actually go out into forests with chainsaws and cut burls off trees, and they use them for other purposes like turned bowls or veneers. It's very valuable for those uses. Gum veins and pockets may occur naturally or caused by tree injuries. The timber is weakened and disfigured by their presence. So for example, you can see there gum veins in blackbutt. It's very common in blackbutt. And it's a bit like burls again. It depends on how you want to use the timber. So for example, as for framing materials or structural materials, those gum veins will be problematic. But if you wanted to make a tabletop and perhaps use an epoxy finish or something like that over the top, then the appearance of them can be quite attractive. Brittle heart and heart rot is decay formed near the heart of the living tree. It usually includes the pith, which, if you remember, is that central section of the tree. It's those cells that grow trees in height, which then rot out very easily. So it usually includes the pith and some of the heartwood. This defect reduces the strength of the timber and affects the aesthetics of the timber. Shakes are caused by the separation of the adjoining layers of wood, either from the centre of the tree along the medullary rays or between the growth rings. Shakes usually occur in the living tree or during the felling process, but can extend or worsen during seasoning. Shakes and checks can often be confused for each other, and we're going to have a look at them both shortly. Now we're looking at seasoning defects. So these defects occur during the drying of the timber. The rate of drying must be carefully managed to avoid seasoning defects. So we're going to talk about checks and shakes. So check is the separation of the wood along the grain, usually in the direction of the medullary rays. So you can see in the picture on the right hand side there, you can see these lines going out from the centre of the tree. They tend to follow the medullary rays. They are checks. Shakes are much longer than checks, but like checks, they reduce the strength of the timber. So for example, in that image on the right, you could classify that, well, I'll call it a split, but it's technically not a split, but that line of damage going along the surface of that piece of timber, that is a shake. A split, and the image doesn't technically have a split in it, a split is a longitudinal crack which extends through the log or board from one surface to another, usually at the end of a piece caused by shrinkage. So that shake there that I identified, if it went all the way through to the other side, that would then be called a split. Collapse is caused by excessive or uneven drying, evidenced by distortion and irregular shrinkage. In most cases, it can be rectified by steaming and re-seasoning the timber. Warping is the broad term that is used to describe any distortion in the timber board that may occur during or after seasoning. Now there's 4 variations, and you know, in some circumstances different terminology is used, but this is what we use in Australia. So bow may be described as the longitudinal curvature of the wide face of the board, and you can see it in the image there. Spring is the curvature of the edge of a piece of timber. Cup is a simple warp across the face of the timber and is common with backsawn wood. So that's where we say it cups away from the centre of the tree. Twist or wind is a spiral warp along the length of a piece of timber and may be caused by sloping grain or poor stacking when seasoning. Now we're going to look at defects due to fungi. So it's part of our sort of third area of classification. So it's fungi or insect attack. So dry rot is caused by a fungi that lives on the wood and devours it as food. Now, despite the term dry rot, a certain moisture content is required for it to thrive. This fungus cannot live in well-ventilated areas. Wet rot, as its name suggests, requires significant moisture and is usually found at the bottom of fence posts and poles below ground level. And it's generally not good practice to, dig timber directly into the ground without some sort of treatment. So the best way to prevent wet rot is to keep the wood dry, don't stick it in the ground, or by impregnating it with a preservative such as creosote. There is another defect, and this is called blue wood staining fungi. Now, it doesn't impair the strength of the wood, but is unsightly. It requires moisture content of at least 20% to thrive. Now, finally, we're going to look at insect attack. So there's two main classifications there. There's borers and there's termites. And they present significant threat to trees, logs, freshly sawn timber and seasoned timber. Can also be threatening to furniture in the home. So the furniture beetle is the most common member of the borer group. It infests the sapwood of softwoods, but rarely attacks native eucalypts. Powder post or lictus beetles are borers that attack the sapwood of some hardwoods. The larvae feed on starch. The heartwood is usually not affected because it does not contain starch. Now, again, just as an aside, generally if you're designing with timber, you do want to avoid using the sapwood in general. You want to use the heartwood because number one, that's where the strength is. Number two, it's usually has better appearance characteristics. But number three, as you can see here, it's less susceptible to attack by borers. Pinhole borers attack green timber. Almost all species of trees are susceptible. They just require timber that is high in moisture content. Termites are often called white ants in Australia, although they are, strictly speaking, they're not really ants. Termites aggressively attack almost any timber they can access with the right conditions. In Australia, there are some notable exceptions. Cypress pine is one. Now, termites will attack cypress, but they will avoid it where possible. The damage produced by termites is often difficult to detect because they prefer dark and poorly ventilated areas. So underneath houses is obviously one. Termites tend to operate from the inside of the boards to the outside. So the damage is usually not noticed until their feeding is complete, and then it's too late. Termites can be prevented via physical barriers such as ant caps or chemical control barriers. Termites require high levels of moisture, therefore good ventilation will reduce the chances of termite attack.